Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jagdeep Ahluwalia. I am the founding secretary of the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce of Greater Houston, which I currently serve as executive director. Today's event is in the series that we had decided to launch in these very unusual circumstances. When 21 years ago we created this chamber, we never realized we would be living in a virtual world where we could bring together, without driving any distance, some of the top leaders in different fields to educate the community across the globe. People logging into these special webinars are from all over the world. I've got people logging in from Canada, from Greece, from India, from Ireland. We've got people from all over the world contributing to the panel and watching the developments that will be discussed today. I do want to thank Dr. Ashish Kamath, who is a strong supporter of the Chamber. He's a director at large at the Chamber and a member of the Chamber, for putting together this great panel. I also want to acknowledge Ashok Garg, our past president and current secretary, who came up with this idea of talking to Dr. Kamath about this. I want to acknowledge Gitesh Desai of Seva International, Dr. Jignesh Shah of the Indian Doctors Association, who are both our partners in this event today, and Mr. Colonel Vipin Kumar of India House, who has helped us with the publicity. Thank you, all of you, for making this possible. I do want to acknowledge our advisors, the Consul General, Mr. Asim Mahajan, who is an advisor to the Chamber, Dr. Renu Khator, Vijay Guradia, Dr. Durga Agarwal, and other advisors who are on the call today. With that, it is my honor and privilege to also, before I actually introduce the incoming president, I would like to display the slide for an upcoming event, which was originally meant for physicians, but we decided to open it up to the whole community. You will be receiving a copy of this. It's a webinar on the provisions of the CARES Act. And though, as I said, most of the questions will be tailored towards physicians and physicians' practices, a lot of the information will be of interest to regular business people. And I want to thank past President Swapan Dhyarevan for putting it together. With that, it's my honor and privilege of introducing the chairman of my board, Tarush Anand. Tarush is an attorney by profession. He is a partner at the law firm of Brown Sims, where he practices civil litigation. He has represented a broad range of domestic and international businesses in various types of business disputes across the country. He has received several awards and honors over the years, including an AV preeminent rating from Martingale Hubble and selection to the Texas Super Lawyers Rising Stars list. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present the president of our chamber, Tarush Anand.
Thank you, Jagdeep. Good morning and welcome everyone to the next in our series of webinars dealing with the various issues that surround the COVID-19 situation we're all facing. For those of you who've been with us before, welcome again. And for those of you who are joining for the first time, thank you for joining us. The Chamber, I think, has done a great job of responding to the COVID-19 issues in a variety of different ways. We early on recognized that even though people were facing various challenges with their businesses and their personal lives, still needed guidance from organizations in the community on how to deal with various aspects of this. So we kicked things off with an employment law seminar to help businesses understand how to deal with their employees in these times. We then pivoted over to tax issues and what tax consequences do businesses face. We went on to the CARES Act and the PPP loans. We've addressed immigration and really addressed this from a variety of angles. And while the first 30 days of this were really focused on helping businesses deal with the short-term consequences of staying alive financially to the COVID-19 crisis, we're now at a point, hopefully, where we can sit back and think about this a little more intellectually and see where we are and where things are going. And so last week, we hosted a wonderful panel with a variety of medical experts on the COVID-19 situation, vaccines, the current epidemiological situation. And this week, I think, is a wonderful follow-up to that, to do an even deeper dive into some of the research medical professionals are doing around the world to understand how we as the human race can face the COVID-19 situation head on. So I am thrilled to have an excellent panel of speakers on board. And the first, let me kick things off by introducing our moderator, Dr. Ashish Kamath. Thank you, Dr. Kamath, for agreeing to host this panel and to provide this wonderful speech. Dr. Kamath is an endowed professor of urological oncology and cancer research at the MD Anderson Cancer Center here in Houston. He's also an Associate Cancer Center Director of the Reliance Hospital in Mumbai, India, and the President of IBCG. Dr. Kamath is recognized internationally as an expert in urologic oncology with an emphasis on immunotherapy, BCG, and organ-sparing treatments. It is my privilege to welcome Dr. Ashish Kamath.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and it is indeed our privilege and pleasure to be able to join you today in this seminar. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you and get the presentation loaded. So the topic of today's webinar essentially is BCG and COVID-19, and how does it relate to things that are going on in India, and also the BADAS, the BADAS Study, BCG as defense against SARS-CoV-2 here in the United States. I have an excellent panel assembled today. Dr. Jeffrey Cirillo is Regents Professor and Director, Center for Airborne Pathogens, Research and Imaging at Texas A&M College of Medicine. He is truly a world expert when it comes to everything and anything to do with pathogens and tuberculosis and BCG. Dr. Andrew Donato is Assistant Professor and Global Tuberculosis Department Lead at Texas Children's Hospital and Baylor College of Medicine here in Houston. Andrew is extremely energetic and again, knows so much about BCG and tuberculosis that you can ask him any question and he would be able to find the answer and the reference. Dr. Paul Hegarty is Consultant Urologic Surgeon, Mater Misericordiae in the University Hospital in Dublin, Ireland. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Hegarty for, almost 18 years now, and he's truly a very energetic urologist and urologic oncologist that practices in many different parts of the world. And of course, as Jagdeep mentioned, we have the pleasure of having a distinguished guest, Mr. Aseem Mahajan, who will join us a little bit later. So what I want to do is set the framework to let our audience know how we came about this study and how we came about identifying BCG and its relationship to COVID-19 and the situation in India. It's all about teamwork. It's all about how one person or a group of people have a vision, they have goals, they reach out for collaboration, they of course need leadership, creativity, and we need people to dive in and essentially get the work done. So this started in March 21st at about 10:44 a.m. when Dr. Donato sent me an email and essentially said, Ashish, and he mentioned his mentor, PhD mentor, who's a world expert on BCG and its antiviral effects, and said, can you help me with what I want to do here in Houston? You can see here, March 22nd, 2:13 a.m., his mentor, Dr. Nedia, reached out to both of us and said, well, yes, we are doing a similar trial in the Netherlands. We don't have any funding, but the more the merrier, and it would be great if we could collaborate. March 22nd, again, at 1:24 p.m., Dr. Hegarty, who at that time was in Greece, and it was pretty early in the morning for him, we started chatting about the situation with BCG because, as you may or may not know, BCG is something that we use fairly commonly for bladder cancer, and it has a lot of immunogenic properties. So we started talking about, well, what is going on with BCG? Can you look up the data? Because Dr. Hegarty had access to all the databases, and he said, yes, let me go ahead and work on it. And that's what led us to analyze the 178 countries back in March when the incidence of COVID-19 was first rising. Dr. Hegarty will talk about this report in more detail, but we published this on March 24th as a preprint on ResearchGate. And you can see, as of the last time that I accessed this about 3 days ago, there were more than 40,000 people who had accessed this and referenced this per se. So this was picked up in India because, again, as you know, BCG is something that's used fairly commonly in India. The Economic Times ran a piece on this and talked about BCG vaccination, and maybe this is the reason that the cases in India were a little bit lower than you would expect. And then, of course, this took off on television in India as well. Rajdeep Sardesai, whom you all know, on India Today TV essentially was again asking me questions as to whether BCG was the reason that people in India were less affected with COVID-19. And again, just another example of an interview that I did with Dr. Donato and Dr. Hegarty that got the word out about the study that we were thinking of. But again, BCG has been used so much for bladder cancer that since 2004, this was something we wrote back in 2004 as part of the AUN News, what is the urologist to do in a BCG shortage? Because there's not enough BCG in the world to go around. And many different organizations in Canada, in Ireland, in the UK, the British Association have essentially talked about how we have to spare BCG for our bladder cancer patients. So this was clearly a problem, and we had to reach out and collaborate, and we did that to the Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network. I've known this network for more than 15 years, ever since they were first being founded. We reached out to the patients, we reached out to the advocates, and they were extremely gracious with allowing us to divert some of the BCG supply towards this study. Then we assembled a faculty, of course, Dr. Sorello, myself, Dr. Donato. From Harvard, we have Dr. Megan Murray, and in California, we have Dr. Arditi, who are the faculty for the initial study. But every study needs money. And of course, you know, even though we were each willing to support the study at our sites with our own research funds and private donor funding, it requires a lot more money to do all the extensive expansion. And of course, you can see from April 3rd to 21st, we submitted this to our various IRBs, and then we waited, and we waited, and we waited. Dr. Sorello then, on the 21st of April, sent this email that got everybody's pulse thumping. Okay, just got off the phone with the Chancellor. Mr. John Sharp, Comptroller for Texas, heavyweight in politics in Texas, and has just given him $2.5 million to run this study. Clearly, this then launched the study, and this is when BADAS actually got formalized on April 21st as the BCG as Defense Against SARS-CoV-2. You can go to this website anytime you want. It's updated fairly regularly, and you can access everything you want to look at. So of course, this got the headline. Texas A&M is now leading the testing of TB vaccine against COVID-19. And this is Dr. Sorello, who will talk to us a little bit later about the study and TB and what goes on behind the scenes. So again, just to emphasize, this was all about teamwork, about getting people together. And as you can see, the panel that we have here is essentially the group that got this kickstarted. It was Dr. Donato, who reached out to me with an idea. I reached out to Dr. Hegarty. We collaborated. We got a quick publication, which got the interest of the world, essentially. And you see this all over the news. Dr. Sorello jumped in, and he got the funding, put his nose to the ground, and essentially got everything going for this study. So with that, I again want to thank my panelists for essentially being here today and joining us in this really important educational event. And with that, Dr. Jeffrey Sorello, you're up next.
Okay, so thank you for giving us a good overview of everything and allowing us the opportunity to present today to all of you. This, I think, is an extremely important study. There's over 100 years worth of data that argues that this vaccine has the potential to improve outcomes for COVID-19. And I think that's an important thing to consider in this, in that we're aware that this probably won't be a complete panacea for this pandemic, and we need to be careful about how we approach what is already known. But based on the evidence, we expect something in the range of 30 to even as high as 70% improvements in mortality, so death rate, as well as severity of disease. And that's quite striking because we're still not controlling the pandemic, and that's the scariest thing. So if it has this potential, and at least in the US, this is the only vaccine that could be released immediately. And that's what we need. We need something that can immediately allow us to intervene, reduce death, reduce severity of disease, reduce burden on healthcare. And so the first thing we looked at when we realized that BCG could be a rapid response to this pandemic and could make a difference in mortality and severity of disease, we started to wonder, okay, if we're going to do this, what groups should we do it in? And we selected healthcare workers in particular, because as you can see in this graph, when there's infections, the first group of people to be infected at a very high rate are healthcare workers. And that's because people who get sick, the first thing they do is they go to their doctors, they go to their hospitals, they go to their clinics. And although that's the right thing to do in general, and it has been in the past, this is an opportunity for exposure to the healthcare workers. And that's why now, in many places in the world, what they're suggesting is people call in instead and do remote diagnosis and remote symptoms, and they give a better idea. But even in that circumstance, if everything is done and then they know that this is a patient and they have to come to the hospital, they realize, okay, this person needs to be intubated, they need oxygen. Healthcare workers are at risk during many of these procedures, and that's why we see such a high frequency of infection in healthcare workers. And remember also that if healthcare workers are infected, that lack of trained personnel dramatically impacts the outcomes for everyone, not just for the healthcare workers themselves. And so if we are able to improve the ability of healthcare workers to do their job so they don't get severe disease and they're not out from work for very long, and they don't get very sick, and we don't have high mortality rates, then this would improve outcomes for everybody. And so that's really our goal, is to work with initially the healthcare worker populations and improve outcomes in them and allow them to give us better care. And then we will look at whether or not this vaccine has a dramatic impact in that population, and then look at staging to go to others. And as Dr. Kamat mentioned, we need to conserve the vaccine we have and not take it away from other groups. And so by staging who we vaccinate, we are improving the possibility that we won't have shortages of vaccine. If you can look at the next slide. So this is where we're at in the United States. And there are trials going on elsewhere. There are trials going on in Australia, the Netherlands, Germany, and all of these trials are coordinated. So we're communicating with all of them. But in the US, it's extremely important because I think many of you are probably aware that BCG vaccination is not done at all in the US. And so a low percentage of the population has already been exposed to the vaccine. And so this vaccine has the potential to have the greatest impact in this population. So the sites that we've started with are based in Houston. So we have 2 sites there. We have 1 in College Station. And the other investigators that are going to talk to you today, 2 of them are located in Houston at Baylor College of Medicine and MD Anderson. And we have to remember to thank MD Anderson in particular for providing the vaccine availability for all of the trial sites that I'm showing here. So the ones in red are the ones that are active sites. The first site that is supposed to happen this week, that we're supposed to actually do our first vaccination, is in College Station, Bryan area, associated with Texas A&M. And then we will have site online in Boston. We expect that to maybe be a week or 2 down the road. And then we have a site at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. And Cedars-Sinai has gained approval now for the study, and they expect to be a week or so behind the Texas A&M site in Bryan College Station. Baylor College of Medicine has also obtained approval, and so we expect them to be coming soon after as well. The thing to remember here is, and that's why I show on this graph, you can see the size of these dots are the hospitalization rates. That's an important number to consider when you think about how many healthcare workers will be infected. And there are certain states with hospitalization rates, so in cases that we know of, as high as 20 to 30%. So this is quite a scary number when you think about it, because you realize that 1/3 of individuals that get infected and show disease at all will have to be hospitalized. And so that's a great burden on our healthcare system. Okay, on the next slide. This is kind of a timeline for where we're at and what the trial plan is, and to give a little bit of perspective for what is going on and why we chose this. You can see the TICE BCG, which is in the phase 4 in the blue line, is very close. It's in what's called a phase 4 trial. And the reason this vaccine in the US can go into phase 4 trials is because it's already FDA approved in the US for bladder cancer. And so that specific strain, the TICE strain, that's why we've chosen that strain, is because it fulfills all the compliance regulations to allow us to almost immediately use it after we complete these phase 4 trials. So we expect to be able to evaluate within a month or two into the trial some idea of how the data is going. If that's a smaller difference, it'll probably take us longer to get the full data and may take as long as 6 months. But we expect to be able to evaluate and release to policymakers some information about whether or not this is working, what degree of effect we're seeing within that time period. Whereas other vaccines, as you probably are aware, are in very early development. There's over 99 vaccines, this number is probably even a little bit old now, that are currently in development and in various stages. I heard the other day that they're going to allow one of these vaccines to go into phase 2. So they are speeding things up a great deal. But even with that, the concerns become, what about safety? What types of side effects are we going to see? Are these really going to have efficacy? Even though they may be safe, are they going to really be protective? And so we have so many questions about specific vaccines that it'll probably take 2 to 3 years for us to have something specific that we are reasonably sure shows good efficacy. In contrast, BCG is ready now. We have, like I say, close to 100 years worth of evidence that the vaccine can reduce mortality and can reduce severity. So that's a very strong argument that we should go forward and do this now. So I'm really excited about this. Okay, so the second line is really how we're thinking about looking at this in terms of time. We look at about half a year being able to make some serious decisions about TICE BCG and knowing whether or not this works, but we are hoping even within a matter of months to be able to say something. At that point, we hope to stage and move forward to comprehensive healthcare workers. That would be the first group that we'd like to ensure get vaccinated. Then stage to first responders, and as you probably are aware, first responders are some of the first to be infected as well, because they're helping patients that get into severe disease before they get to the hospital. Law enforcement also, and possibly you've seen, there's a lot of confusion in the US and actually throughout the world right now caused by this pandemic. And so law enforcement is always having to deal with these issues, and as such, they end up getting infected more frequently than other groups. And then after that, we have a lot of communication with various groups that are very excited about getting the vaccine and are really impatient. And these include teachers, child care workers. I get emails all the time from people within these groups. And it's very sad that we can't go and vaccinate all of them right away, because obviously that would result in shortages. So we're trying to make a measured response. But certainly for food service workers and then the elderly population in particular are more predisposed for severe disease. And so we'd like to look at that group to get the vaccine early. So I'd expect to go to each of these groups in a staging fashion first and then go to the general public if ultimately this ends up in a national vaccination program. So where are we at for funding? I mean, $2.5 million, we're very thankful to the Chancellor for providing the funds. And it sounds like a lot of money, but in reality, it's not. We can do about 1,800 healthcare workers. That's where we're at right now. But there also is an issue now of concern about cognitive effects. And we have seen with the loss of taste and smell and the effects on dementia and cognitive function by COVID-19. So there's some suggestion that the brain may be involved in COVID-19 infection. We've started a parallel study. It's going to be a sub-study within this study to better understand, one, whether or not COVID-19 is causing effects on the brain, and two, there is some evidence in the literature that BCG can reduce cognitive impairment later in life. And this comes out of the bladder cancer community, in fact, and those individuals that have received BCG for bladder cancer are less likely to get Alzheimer's disease later in life. So it suggests the BCG vaccine may also have this benefit. And so within this trial, we're going to be looking at that. So all of this together says, okay, with 2.5 million, we can get this initial 6-month study done. But to go to comprehensive healthcare workers, to deal with all of the sites that are already contacting us in healthcare environment alone, we need additional funding. Really, if you look at all the groups I talked about for staging and so on, even before we got to a national vaccination program, we're really talking hundreds of millions of dollars to implement this at all the sites that are interested and to get into all of the groups that really need to receive this, and to continue to do some trials to better understand the effects and the mechanisms of action. So that's where we're at right now. I think we're doing well, and we've been helped to respond very quickly. Everybody has worked together well. It's been very exciting, a great collaborative team, but we're still at the very early stages. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was very informative. We got a couple of questions, and one actually was fairly basic. What is BCG? And I typed up a response, but as we move to our next presenter, Dr. Donato. Dr. Donato, as I mentioned, is assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine. Andrew, as you start speaking about what you were going to talk regarding the mechanism of BCG, if you could just, in a few simple terms, let our audience know what exactly is BCG, and maybe briefly the history of BCG and how it came about to be used today. Andrew?
Sure. First of all, again, thank you for inviting us to this forum. And let me apologize. I'm stealing Paul's name tag here just because of a mistake with Zoom. But so BCG is a live attenuated vaccine. So that means it's a vaccine that's weaker than the original strain. It was developed in the 1920s, 1930s in France. It was passaged over 200 times in order to develop its attenuated, weakened form, the format that that is used and has been used. It is a vaccine for tuberculosis. It prevents disseminated and severe forms of tuberculosis. It's estimated to save multiple pediatric lives a year. And so what we're going to start talking about, Dr. Kaman, if you could move to my first slide, is the work by which BCG was identified to induce non-specific trained immunity. So each one of our cells contains around 2 meters of DNA. So if you took the DNA out of one of your cells and unraveled it and unpacked it, it would be 2 meters long. Now, the packing of the DNA is not haphazard. It's organized very specifically, and it's organized such that a neuron, a brain cell, is going to have its DNA packaged in a way very different than a cell in our gut, a way that's going to turn off and not allow genes that are necessary to function for the gut to be functioning in the brain. So since the development of immunity, 1880s, 1890s, we identified that there were immune memories. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we identified that these memories were specific, and specificity of immune memories were due to B and T lymphocytes. But some researchers identified that some memories are not specific. And over the past decade, mostly out of Mihai Natia's group in the Netherlands, they identified the mechanism of non-specific immune memory. And what they were able to identify is that when you have one antigenic stimulation, in this case, what was most studied was BCG. And BCG was studied because there were so many studies that showed that if you give kids BCG, they actually have lower rates of dying from other causes not related to tuberculosis. So there were studies that showed that children who got BCG also were protected from a different type of pneumonia due to pneumococcus. They were also protected from sepsis. They were also protected from acute respiratory infections. And multiple epidemiology studies had shown this. So Dr. Natia's group started looking at the mechanisms and trying to understand why BCG induced these non-specific changes. What they found was it's related to the mechanism at which the DNA is wrapped up inside the cells. That terminology, the format at which the DNA is wrapped, is called epigenetics. So it's not a change in the actual DNA sequence, it's a change in the wrapping, the conformation of the DNA. And what they were able to find out is that when BCG stimulates immune cells, it induces metabolic changes. Those metabolic changes then induce conformation changes in the chromatin. Now, chromatin is just the terminology for the proteins by which the DNA is wrapped. Once that DNA is wrapped differently because of BCG, in animal models or cell culture models, or even human models, they found that because of the differential wrapping of the DNA, those cells are better able to respond to non-specific pathogens. For example, when humans were given BCG, and then a few weeks later challenged with different viral infections, they were actually able to clear the virus quicker. Now, once infected with the virus like coronavirus, the adaptive immune response, the classic B cell and T cell adaptive immune response, takes 7 to 14 days to develop. The innate immune response, the non-specific immune response from monocytes and natural killer cells, are determining the host effect during those first 1 to 2 weeks before the adaptive response has kicked in. So you can see here in this study, when individuals were BCG vaccinated and later challenged with a virus called yellow fever, now it was an attenuated form of the yellow fever virus, they had lower amounts of virus in their blood 5 days later. Now, interestingly, you can see in panel C, they didn't have an overactivated cytokine response. In fact, the cytokines were lower, and we think the reason that these cytokines were lower is because the innate immune response was able to act quicker, earlier, and decrease the amount of virus in the blood. This is the basic science and the epigenetic basis for the study that we are planning. We think that BCG will awaken the innate immune response, restructure the DNA such that the cells are able to better and quicker respond to non-specific pathogens such as the coronavirus. And therefore we'll have an increased number of individuals that develop mild symptoms or develop no symptoms at all, that they develop the coronavirus infection and remain asymptomatic. Based on other studies, we're hoping that approximately 30 to 80% of individuals will have some sort of benefit due to BCG if they are then infected with coronavirus. Ashish, I believe that's my last slide.
It is, Andrew. I'm always fascinated when you explain it, so I was actually, enthralled myself. But thank you so much. So, great. So our next panelist is Dr. Paul Hagerty. Paul had the distinct pleasure, I think, of being in Houston twice. Once when he and I were actually almost co-fellows together, and subsequently when he actually came back and I don't know, decided to actually ask me if I would be involved in some part of his training. And I said yes, and now here he is. So Paul, you're up.
Great, thanks for having me. Thanks, Dr. Kamat. I certainly have very fond memories of my time in Houston. I went there originally in the year 2000 or 2002 when Dr. Kamat was a fellow himself. And I still distinctly remember him starting an operation and handing over, supervising me while I did it. And I went, wow, this is fantastic. And so as I continued training in the UK, all I could think of is how fantastic Houston was. And I made it my utmost priority to get back to Houston. And I was glad to be there from 2007, 2009 to work in the top cancer center in the world. And for me, that was the highlight of my training. And I still remember it. It's given me a sense of stamina and quality that is continuing throughout my career. And I'm very grateful for the training that, and I have very fond memories of my time in Houston. So I'm very pleased to be talking across the Atlantic to you. And it's because of social media that we've managed to do this, but also how we've managed to do our study. Because as Dr. Kamal earlier said, there was an email went across from Holland to him, asking him, and then very quickly he was on to me for some other reason, and that opened up the whole discussion. And we got busy with doing the data analysis. And at that time, if you look at the first slide, Europe was in the throes of a very severe phase of the pandemic. And the countries that were very heavily hit were Italy, France, Spain. And so then if you look at the next picture here, next slide, we decided to see how this compared with BCG coverage. And the countries in red do not have BCG. And if I look at the next slide with both them side by side, you'll see that they're, even before you do any statistics, is that using your eyeball, you can see that the countries which were hardest hit seem to correlate very strongly with the countries that do not have a BCG program. So then we went on to study all the countries of the world, and we had 178 countries and territories. And we drew together data from populations, look at the incidence and mortality of COVID-19, and then compared it with the BCG status. And just on technical terms, a case fatality rate is number of persons who died from COVID-19 divided by the number of known cases infected by COVID-19. So case fatality rate, a very important piece of data. And then when we did our first analysis in March, we looked at the whole population in the world of 7.5 billion, of which 6.7 billion had received BCG and 800,000 had not. And the mortality was far higher in the countries that did not have a current program of BCG vaccination. And we were worried that this might be just because these countries were early on in the process and we didn't have good data. So we analyzed again on the next slide that in April the 10th, and in fact the difference was even more striking. These curves were separating further. The death per million was, countries with no BCG was nearly 100 per million versus 2 per million in those with BCG coverage. And it also meant that the case fatality rate in the last column on the right, if they had BCG, was 3% and no BCG was approaching 7%. And so the highlight of that was we showed a 3% reduction in death rate among people who had been infected with BCG. So not only was the incidence reduced, but also the mortality more important. And then when we compare the two different dates, you can see that the case fatality rate was 10 times higher among those without the BCG. So this is in India. You can see that while the cases were increasing in those 2 weeks, that the case fatality rate was still very low, 0.4%, when you've countries having up to 10% case fatality rates. So India seems to have done very well. So on the next slide, we can see that India has seen that while the death rate has increased 22-fold in the time of the study, we've shown that BCG vaccination in childhood, of which India is a prime example, seems to have a much lower case fatality rate compared to other parts of the world. And India seems to have fared better than many countries in Europe and America. And this is an observation. So on the next slide, we see that we wanted to see, was this just an anomaly or a statistical coincidence? So we looked at countries neighboring in Europe in particular. We matched them according to their health indices, their economic indices, and one would have BCG and the other not. And then we waited until each country had 100 infected, so that we were comparing like at the time of infection. So on the next slide, you can see that the country of each pairing, there is the pair on the left is the country without BCG. The pair on the right has BCG. And when we compare Spain and Portugal, for example, the case fatality rate was 3 times higher per population in Spain versus Portugal. Italy and Croatia, which are neighbors with similar cultures. And again, Croatia was 8 times less likely to die from it. Slovenia and Slovakia, likewise, 13 times different. And then Sweden and Estonia, 4 times more likely. And that's correcting for the population, for the cases of incidence. So the actual death rates were that much different. And we didn't find a single pairing that did the opposite to this. So it was consistently between 3 and 13 times more likely that countries that had BCG compared to their neighbors would have a lower fatality rate. Next slide, please. So the highlight of it was that we found that countries that have a whole population of vaccination with BCG had a 3% lower death rate compared with those without a BCG program. But next slide, the warnings that we have, the caveats. This comes with a health warning. This is an observational study with many potential confounders. And so that would be a criticism of making decisions just on an observation. And just because the population risk is reduced, this may not translate into an individual risk. So if you said, my dad has had the BCG, is he less likely to get this COVID? We do not know. And that's where these trials that Dr. Kamat and Dr. DiNardo and Dr. Sturlo are driving forward are crucially important to answer the questions. And not only does it improve it, it'll also hopefully give us an idea of the magnitude of improvement. So we can see about how to integrate that with other healthcare measures and how much we can free up our population. I'll hand back more to Dr. Kamat.
Thank you, Dr. Hegarty. That was very nicely summarized. So back to the home stretch of this before we have our esteemed guest, Consul General Mahajan, speak to us. And then after that, we will be answering some questions that have been jotting down with an open panel with all the microphones open. But again, I want to emphasize that this took teamwork. It's teamwork that essentially led to this being launched, and it's teamwork that will lead to this being completed. One of the things that I have been asked repeatedly, and I'm sure many of you who are listening in have seen, is that the lockdown in India has essentially allowed the curve to be flattened, but this is causing severe issues in a country with a high level of poverty, of course. There's deaths by hunger, starvation, suicide, more, and clearly images like this have flooded not only the internet, but the news media as well. And it's because of this that individuals in India that I have spoken to, and I know Dr. DiNardo and Dr. Sturlo have talked to as well, have been asking, well, can we just take this BCG and administer to everybody? And they've actually started doing that in small studies. So, there's one study in Maharashtra that's looking at giving this to elderly individuals. There's another one by the African Institute that's actually giving this to patients once they get infected, and that study has come up as well. But as Dr. Hegarty mentioned, and we all caution, we need to do these in a controlled manner with the science driving it. We don't want to just go out and start vaccinating everybody and not analyzing whether it actually helps a particular group of patients or individuals or not. And that, again, is where we feel that with the work that we've done here in Texas and across the US, and of course with our close ties through the IACCGH and Consul General and the Ambassador in Washington, DC, we can, of course, help India and the Indian BCG vaccination program. Clearly, India has the capacity to make a lot of vaccine, but if you make a lot of it and don't apply it properly, that will essentially be wastage of BCG. So we need to actually join hands and work together. And with that, I will hand it over to IACCGH for the Consul General to talk to us, and then we'll get back to the panel discussion with some Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Kamath. This is Jagdeep Ahluwalia again. I'd like to make a couple of points before we move forward. The first is, as you said, everything is about partnerships, and I want to thank Seva International, Gitesh Desai, their president, and the Indian Doctors Association, and Jignesh Shah, their president, for partnering with us on this very important webinar. Thanks to Seva, we are having a feed through their portal to their members. IACCGH is also feeding this out. I also want to mention that I was on a call with some of my classmates from my engineering school in India, and they were complimenting the government of India in the food delivery system that has been set up. You did mention that there are issues with food, and he mentioned, one of my friends mentioned that all you had to do was pick up and call a particular number. If you were in what's called a red zone, the government was making it a point to make sure that you received food grains or whatever you needed to survive because of the lockdown within an hour, which I believe is commendable. So I do want to compliment India, because when I remember when I first came to America, we always said the problems in India are 9 times, because we were 1/3 the size of America and 3 times the population at that time. So the problem magnifies and grows larger, but I want to compliment the government of India for whatever they have been able to achieve in these unforeseen circumstances. With that, I want to welcome the first citizen of India in Houston, a man that we have grown very closely to, the Consul General of India in Houston, the Honorable Asim Mahajan. Prior to assuming charge as Consul General of India in Houston, he was Ambassador of India to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. In his earlier diplomatic assignments, he has served as Deputy High Commissioner in Indian missions in Kuala Lumpur and Dhaka, and as the Consul General of India, Osaka, Japan. He has also served in Indian missions in Tokyo and Laos. In his stints in the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, he has served on various desks handling affairs related to the United Nations, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and the Maldives. Besides, he has also served as the staff officer to the Minister of State for External Affairs and as Joint Secretary coordinating the management of the annual Hajj pilgrimage from India. He has a master's degree in diplomatic studies from the University of Oxford in the UK, a master's degree in management studies from the Birla Institute of Technology and Sciences, Pilani in India, and has annual training courses in World Trade Organization law from the Advisory Center on WTO law, Geneva. He speaks Japanese apart from English, Hindi, and some other Indian languages. He is married with a son and a daughter. It is my honor and privilege to invite the Consul General of India, our distinguished guest today, the Honorable Asim Mahajan, to please address the group.
Thank you, Jagdeep. Thank you to all of you and to all the doctors. Dr. Kamath, of course, was there, and all the other doctors who are here joining us today for this very important subject, and I think which is which is something which is in media these days, and all of you are obviously aware of the focus on medical research these days. At least in my career as a diplomat, I have never seen so much of focus, so much of basic media coverage, and so much of interest. And obviously, for reasons which are all known to us, all of us are earnestly hoping that there will be a cure, there will be some medicines, and there are several strands of medical research going on. So what I will actually do in these 2-3 minutes is try to give a broader picture, and then probably pick up on this on the themes which are mentioned in this study. So Jagdeep, as we have also on earlier occasions in our earlier interactions mentioned about the Indo-US relations in general, the tremendous potential for strengthening our trade and economic ties. But I think in this part of the United States where we are based, with the biggest medicity in the world, there is tremendous potential in the area of medical research and healthcare. We are working on many themes together, which include, of course, this joint research on how the BCG vaccine, whether it plays a role in immunity or helping in this current pandemic, but also in areas like plasma therapy, where a lot of research is going on in India, it is going on equally here. And then finally on the global supply chains. That is something which at a strategic level, both countries are in touch with each other, and amongst the many other sectors, areas where we are going to strengthen our collaboration and where we are going to work together, medical research and healthcare, I think, are currently in the focus. We are looking at how both countries can partner together. There are companies based in Houston who are doing work. There are companies based all over the United States. We have a whole network of companies who are manufacturing in India, who are manufacturing critical supplies, including for PPE and other things. So this is something, I think, which is an ongoing thing, and we will continue to work. We can work together. In the presentations made today, it is quite amply clear that this research in this area about enhancing immunity amongst, by using enhanced immune enhancing capability of the BCG vaccine, which Dr. Kamath and other doctors have all equally emphasized on, and they are trying to put together the data and the research together. It is an important area which we all need to look at. We all in India are aware from childhood we got immunized, and India is one of the countries where BCG inoculation has been there. And I have myself seen a lot of studies which are actually comparing countries where it was done away with, which includes probably the United States and some countries in Europe who decided not to universalize it. But in India, obviously, because of tuberculosis and the prevalence of tuberculosis from childhood, everyone is inoculated. And it is really interesting to see these data and figures which have been presented today in terms of the statistics and the mortality rates. While these are early days for these studies, what I can definitely mention is that we stand ready to assist, of course, on my part, to assist in strengthening the linkages between institutions in India and United States, which means building much deeper linkages, much more structured institutional linkages with the Medicity here, with the MD Anderson Institute here, and other medical research institutions in Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and also in area of healthcare and medical research, which we have a lot of big American companies based here, a lot of groups based here, a lot of collaboration even in the field of ICT. So we stand ready. And on this particular study, I really find some of these observations very interesting, and it actually gives us a lot of hope that there is something which will actually parallelly work with the many other strands of research which are going on, including the recent drug trials which are taking place. There has been positive news on some drug trials, and equally this study can play a very vital role in our joint efforts. In India also, as all of you would be aware, this is something which a lot of doctors are looking at in India. There are groups in India. The Indian Council for Medical Research has brought out data and statistics on this. So these clinical trials and research on data sets is going on in India also. So Jagdeep, on that note, I think I stand ready to connect with all the doctors who are here today, and I really thank them for taking out the time and sharing so much of useful information with us, because this is something which brings hope to all of us, and this will be the way forward in this pandemic, because they are now really, as we call, the first responders and on the frontier of this. And also one observation which I would like to make, and I am seeing every day in the media, never before in history there has been so much of collaboration across the globe for dealing with one pandemic. And I think that leads us to a very important pathway for the future, where we can bring institutions together. We are in United States, Washington, all the consulates, we are working together to bring several institutions together, and I have seen it scaling up across the world. So like from Ireland, we have Dr. here, and he just gave us a presentation. There are many other doctors who are globally connected on different strands, and I think this is the way forward in the future, that we jointly do the work so that the synergies can be built on, and all these studies can be really, they can pool it into something which comes out eventually to deal with this pandemic at the earliest, because you are seeing the impact of this on all our lives, on not just the economy, but on how people move across the world. So thank you very much, and I really thank the doctors for this work which is going on, and I will of course connect with them to further take it forward with building institutional linkages in India. So thank you, Jagdeep.
Tarish Anand, the president of the Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of the board of directors and everyone else here at the Chamber, once again, we'd like to thank our distinguished panel of doctors, starting with Dr. Ashish Kamath and every other panelist we've had here today. That was a very engaging seminar, and we thank you very much again. Mr. Mahajan, Council General Mahajan, thank you again for your support and your participation in today's webinar. It always is a great honor to have you join us today. We invite you to stay in touch with us by visiting our website to learn about upcoming events. We are constantly trying to think of new events that will be of value to our membership, our business members, and the community at large. And if you have ideas for future presentations, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you and tailor events to what fits the needs of our community. You can reach us by emailing info@iaccgh.com. Thank you again, everyone. Be safe and stay healthy.
Tarush, before we log off, my apologies, I lost my feed for a minute. Dr. Kamath is available to answer some of the questions that were sent in. So with your permission, Tarush, we would like to continue the webinar for another few minutes to respond to some of the questions that Dr. Kamath and the esteemed panel are willing to respond to.
Of course.
And Dr. Kamath, while you're setting up, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we have many media partners that support the Chamber. We have TV Asia that gives a feed. We've got local radio programs like Open Forum that support us with American newspapers. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the local media and TV Asia that support our programs. With that, Dr. Kamath, on to you.
Great, thank you so much, because we got a whole bunch of questions, and I tried to answer some of them by typing, but I think a panel discussion with my esteemed colleagues would be a lot more useful. Jeff, Andrew, if you could unmute your mics, we'll sort of do this in a panel way. So one of the first questions that came up, and Andrew, you raised your hand for this one. Can BCG, number one, be administered at any age? And as a corollary to that, I guess, is the BCG that people receive at birth in India similar to the BCG that we're using now?
Happy to take the first one. So BCG is administered worldwide to neonates, children, immediately after birth, but it has been studied in adults and it's been studied in elderly, and it's been shown to be safe and efficacious at all ages. I'm embarrassed to answer the second one with Dr. Jeff Cerrillo on the phone, but I'll start by saying, yes, there's 7 strains of BCG. So there are differences between the strains that are used in different countries. And I'll just leave it at that. Too shy to answer the rest with a world expert on the line.
Well, I wanted to put you on the spot there, Andrew, because I knew Jeff was looking at you and had a grin on his face. But that segues into the second question, and Jeff, I'll let you take this. The question essentially was, what is the difference in the various strains that are being studied across the globe? And are any strains going to make the response to COVID infection worse because of the cytokine storm?
So the majority of the evidence, and it's without doing the trial, and that's really, that question is part of the crux for why we're doing this trial, is to better understand positive and negative immune response. But all of the data at this point argue that there's two arms of the immune response. It's like a seesaw or a swing. You can be one way or the other. You can't be both. And so what happens as we have a good response, we take away from the bad response, and the bad response takes away from the good response. What COVID-19 appears to do with its cytokine storm is cause this bad response. And so as we take the machinery, the power away from that bad response toward a good response, usually they are not going to be able to exist at the same time. And so that's the great advantage we have with BCG, is we have a lot of data showing that it fights that response. One great example is you almost never see an anaphylactic or an allergic reaction with BCG. That's very strong evidence that it's very difficult for you to get the type of inflammatory or cytokine type storm that you would see with these viral infections. So most of the evidence argues against it, but we're doing the study and we'll have the data very, very soon. In terms of the strains, there are ways that we can work with the different strains. We have an understanding. It's actually, Andrew's a little off. It's a lot more than 7 different strains, but that's okay. There's more like 16, but they have been studied in great detail. We know a great deal about every single one of these strains, down to every single nucleotide in their genome. So the amount of detail is probably more than we know about most things. We also know that differences in the ability of these strains to show positive effects have not been observed in different countries to the extent that we know these differences exist. So we know there are differences, but none of them have yet shown any effect in humans. And so that's the biggest issue. It appears to be that based on how they're being produced in each country, and every country has a slightly different producer. Some producers actually send out to multiple countries, but in the US there's one producer. So we have a pretty simple issue right now. But overall, how it's made impacts whether or not it works well, and we know how to grow every single strain, so it appears to work well. And so that's what we would need to do, is as we use, say one strain is used in a different location, we need to modify how it's produced, and that will ensure that it works properly. And so at least we know this. So this is something that we know very well now. So I'm highly confident that we'll be able to do this worldwide if we need to, in a way that works for everyone.
Great, thank you. Paul, a few questions came up along the lines of, well, how does BCG help bladder cancer? If you could just briefly address that.
So this is work done for the last 30, 40 years now, showing that when BCG is placed into the bladder, we typically get 6 installations, and then we put them on a maintenance program. The contact between the BCG and the bladder excites cells that are actually designed to kill cancers. And so it's not just like a vaccination of a single exposure. You need repeated exposure in the bladder to have this tumor killing effect. And it's by far the most effective treatment into the bladder for preventing not just recurrence of cancer of the bladder, but also progression to a more deadly format of it. And it still is by far the best. And the rates of response are far greater than a lot of chemotherapies in other cancers. And so it's amazing that we can put something into the bladder, which is not so toxic to the human, and have such a great response. And we urologists, we've been doing this for decades now, and it's quite standard. We're quite comfortable with the looking after patients with this. And so that's probably why we are involved with the study as well.
Yeah, one of the points I like to make is that BCG is one of the oldest and most effective immunotherapies we have in the cancer world. We hear a lot more about drugs in the news nowadays that are more novel. They cost about $10,000 a single dose. BCG is about $120 per dose for a bladder cancer patient. And one point I do want to make, because this comes up often, is we can, in theory, vaccinate 500 individuals with the amount of BCG that comes in a vial for one bladder cancer patient. Of course, with the logistics of making up the vial and injecting people, it's hard to get 500 people done within 2 to 4 hours. So realistically, it's more like 150 to 200 people if things are very efficient. But it's a much lower dose that's used for vaccination than is used for cancer therapy. But in the cancer world, it's the most effective immune therapy that we have currently. Next question, Andrew, if you could address this one. The question came up is, how can people sign up in Houston?
Well, approval in Houston, the last approval for Baylor College of Medicine was achieved on Thursday. Actually, I hope within an hour to send the first recruitment emails out. The healthcare worker study, as was introduced, we're looking for individuals who are at highest risk and would get the most benefit from the vaccine. So people that are interested, we should have access via a website, and then individuals who qualify, hopefully we can start vaccinating within approximately 1 to 2 weeks. The website that we will have more information added to the BCG as Defense Against SARS website quickly.
Great, thank you, Andrew. This question, I guess, Jeff, I'll let you address this because you started to talk about this, is how much funding will it require to make this available to everybody and not just healthcare workers?
When you're saying everyone, that's the question, is how broad are you wanting me to go? Everyone in the US or everyone in the world?
Take it both ways.
Everyone in the world is a tougher question because there are socio-political issues there that oftentimes serve as barriers and increase costs. So in the US, certainly it would cost hundreds of millions, if not billions, to actually implement this type of vaccination program nationwide. It seems very straightforward, but setting up sites, making sure everything's done, and production, and then quality control on that has a lot of expense to it. But that isn't something that we would be responsible for doing all through us. I think what we would be responsible for doing is the earlier stages of that as we expand it out to other groups. So a nationwide program would then come at that national level. And I think our job in that is to communicate with policymakers well. We've already begun doing that. I think it's important for us to continue doing that throughout the process and make sure that everyone is patient and make sure we don't jump the gun. I think that's one of the problems we have also, is people are too quick to draw conclusions. And so we need people to be a little bit patient. Now, worldwide, based on World Health Organization figures, it's clearly billions of dollars in order to get these implemented throughout the world. And it may be as much as hundreds of billions, just depending on what types of barriers exist and ensuring, because you have to remember there are a lot of countries that already give BCG vaccine. I think it'll be much cheaper there because they already have everything in place to do it. But there's still a good number of countries that don't. and coverage there, and ensuring coverage, I think, is going to be very expensive. And production, I don't think we have enough production right now. But luckily, there was a time when many other producers were in place, and based on my communication with some of these producers, the facilities still exist and have the capability to be repurposed. So I think it's going to require the public to come out and say, look, we all want this, policymakers to be on board, and I think that the commercial manufacturers, the producers, are going to be stepping up at that time.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about the Serum Institute of India and Mr. Poonawalla, Cyrus Poonawalla, who founded the Serum Institute, and his son, Adar Poonawalla, whom many of the folks that are listening in know personally. They've been going on and saying that they're going to make 100 million doses available to whoever wants to use it of their recombinant BCG, and I think that's sort of where that question came in. And I know you answered this already. And Andrew, I was going to look to you, but I'll give it back to Jeff since you punted it to him the last time around. But Jeff, would you caution against using the recombinant BCG in India or in the US or anywhere, or would you be open to looking at that as well?
That one, yeah, that's a little bit of a hot potato. I'm going to admit that. Stefan Kaufman, I know personally, and I think there's a lot of good data with that specific vaccine. It looks very good, but we don't, considering that with the other vaccines, we actually have tens of years, if not 50 years worth of data regarding their safety and efficacy. I think we should be careful about moving forward with that specific strain yet on a large scale. So I think what we'd like to see, particularly with that strain, is larger trials before we went forward to something that's doing millions of people at once.
Okay. Andrew, if you could address the next couple of questions, I'll lump them together. Essentially, the theme is, if someone was vaccinated at birth, say, in the 60s or 70s, does it mean that they're still immune, number one? Number two, if someone was vaccinated 10 years ago, does that mean they're still immune?
Yeah, so the answer is yes and no. So what we were studying, I spend a good amount of my time in the beautiful country of Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland. And what we found out there is that the way the DNA is organized, the way it is folded inside the nucleus, changes in a severely detrimental way if you have other chronic infections. So for example, you can have an infection called schistosomiasis, which is a waterborne helminth infection. And if you have that infection, it completely wipes away your BCG vaccine immunity. And that's actually been known for at least 20 or 30 years. And studies have shown that these other severe infections or other chronic infections wipe away vaccine immunity. And what we showed around 2 years ago was that one of the mechanisms at which these other severe or chronic infections wipe away vaccine immunity is by changing the epigenetic structure. So changing how the DNA is formatted inside the nucleus. So we don't have the data yet to understand how long it lasts. But the answer is probably, it depends. Have you been severely ill? Did you get cancer? If you got cancer, we know that you also have a restructuring of your epigenome and you lose a lot of vaccine immunogenicity. Did you have a bad car accident and get admitted to the ICU? Did you have one of these chronic infections? If any of those happened, you probably lost your beneficial vaccine immunogenicity. If not, you probably still have it. But these are questions that I'm hopefully using the word probably enough to let you know that these are things we have to answer.
Great, thank you. So again, as we're coming up, and I want to be respectful of my panelists' time, I do want to first thank the IACCGH for giving us this opportunity, the Consul General for proclaiming in a public forum that he and his group are very supportive of the effort that we're doing here in Houston in the US, and of course taking it over to India. Thank you very much, Consul General Mahajan. And in closing, I would like to, before Jagdeep, before you take over, I would just like to give my panelists maybe 10, 15 seconds for closing thoughts. So let's start in the order that you presented. Jeff, if you want to go first, just some closing thoughts on what's going on.
You know, I appreciate the great support overall that we've gotten from everybody involved, especially all of the policymakers, particularly in the various countries that have contacted us and discussed this with us. What I'm seeing is a very intelligent response overall, and that basically all of the risks and benefits are being weighed prior to running forward and charging into this. I think it takes a lot of patience to sit for a month or two while something like this is going on, and we're all in that situation. Be certain that all of us, our team, are doing the best we can, and really our goal is to try to figure out how we can save as many lives as we possibly can, and that puts us on a time crunch too. We will do the best we can. Thank you.
Andrew?
Sure. Again, thank you for having us. I think we have an option to learn a lot about how host immunity works while very pragmatically improving clinical outcomes. I think this needs to be done safely and efficiently, and I think we're on our way to do that. So just want to say thank you to everybody who's helped us. It's been a great teamwork and collaborative effort so far, and hopefully we can get a positive signal in the coming months.
Thank you, Andrew. Paul?
I think randomized controlled trials normally take about a year to set up and cost several million to run. I think this is a great opportunity to get a fast answer and relatively inexpensively. I think there'll be great bang from the buck for those who support this trial. Everybody's gunning for it to be successful, and it's being set up right. We have the right people from around the world and expertise with track record for getting results at the end. And so I think this is the best trial I've ever been involved in, and I think it's an exciting time. Everybody's keen to do everything they can to help the whole world with regard to this. So I'm very grateful to the IACCGH and to the Consul for their support and their activity in this.
Thank you, Paul. And with that, I will hand it over back to you, Jagdeep. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are very honored to have such a distinguished panel addressing the community, not just in Houston, but across the world. I would like to request the Consul General to make some brief remarks before I...
Yeah. No, thank you, Jagdeep. And I would like to thank Dr. Kamath, Dr. Jeff, Dr. Paul, Dr. Andrew. It's really very useful. And as I offered in the beginning, in fact, I have already been speaking to Dr. Kamath. We will connect you for some institutional linkages in India. And it's rightly pointed out that time is of a sense for us. So whatever we can do jointly to share the pool of our data, and because it is for public good and good for all of us. And lastly, I wanted to request all the 4 doctors. They are all very distinguished doctors, and they have great resources and knowledge. Please do share with us ideas on how we can strengthen institutional linkages with India on any area which you deem appropriate and fit. I really would be very appreciative of your reaching out to us individually, or Jagdeep, if you can help us, because any one small idea, if it gets scaled up, it actually gains traction, and I have seen it really helps us in this time. So thank you again, and especially to Dr. Paul, who connected all the way from Ireland, and I understand wake up early in the morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Consul General. As I have mentioned in the past, the Chamber has been involved in healthcare for the last 20 years. We were responsible for connecting MD Anderson to Tata Cancer in Mumbai more than 15 years ago, when John Mendelsohn was running MD Anderson and Katie Dinshaw was running Tata Cancer. We lost both of them to cancer, unfortunately, but the chamber is here to support you. Tarush and the whole board is here to support you. And we had some very powerful meetings with you since your arrival. And I remember that healthcare and education were both on the top of your priority list, as they are for the chamber. And this is all part of education. Another message I'd like to pass on to the panelists is that we have some very important resources like Seema Kachru with the Press Trust of India and Manisha Gandhi of Asia and the local radio programs and media that we can connect all of you to, so that we can help spread your message to a much wider cross-section of the community. With that, on behalf of the chairman of the board, Tarush Anand, and the members of the chamber, we want to thank you. But before we drop this call or finish this webinar, I also want to give a shout out to Gopal Savjani of Ansh Labs, who is working very actively on a antibody test that he has developed. And we'd be happy to share his work with the group on today's call. With that, I want to thank everybody, not only who is on the panel, but every person who joined today's webinar and the Consul General of India for making today's webinar a success. It will be recorded. It has been recorded. And I want to thank Kosh Bayani, Yasmin with the consulate, and Bhavna Kalyan with the chamber, who will be working together to make the recording available to you and who were behind the success of today's webinar. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen who are participating, and thank you to the panelists.